topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
What's working on purpose anyway? Each week, we ponder the answer to this question. People ache for meaning and purpose at work, to contribute their talents passionately and know their lives really matter. They crave being part of an organization that inspires them and helps them grow into realizing their highest potential. Business can be such a force for good in the world, elevating humanity. In our program, we provide guidance and inspiration to help usher in this world we all want, working on purpose. Now, here's your host, Dr. Alise Cortez.
Welcome back to the Working on Purpose program. Thanks for tuning in again this week. Great to have you. This program has been on air since February of 2015, and I love every single week of it. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. If you don't know me, we've not met yet. I am a management consultant, an organizational logotherapist, speaker, and author. My team and I at Alise Cortez and Associates help companies to enliven and fortify their operations by articulating their purpose and building inspirational leaders and cultures activated by meaning and purpose to turn those companies from a flatline EKG to a vibrant destination workplace. There, people are intrinsically motivated to perform at their best, grow to their fullest potential, and are committed to stay and dynamically deliver on the company's mission. You can learn more about us and how we can work together at alisecortez.com. Getting in today's program, we have with us Dr. Peter Kim. He is a professor of management and organization at the Marshall School of Business at the University of Southern California. He's devoted decades to his research on trust and is the author of How Trust Works, the Science of How Relationships Are Built, Broken, and Repaired, which we'll be talking about today. He joins us from the Los Angeles area. Dr. Kim, welcome to Working on Purpose.
Thank you, Dr. Cortez. It's a pleasure being here.
It's really magnificent, as we were saying before we got on air, this beautiful thing that you produced. It's just stunningly gorgeous. And as I said to you, and I'm prone to do, this is going to be one of those dead jokes. This is harder than bringing a baby into the world, so congratulations.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I don't mean to make you blush, but it really is. And I also, before we get started, Peter, I really want to just acknowledge you for how beautiful your book is. It's incredibly well researched. I can feel your heart in there. I can feel your integrity. I can feel your elevated consciousness, and I can feel your intentions to make the world a better place. And I just really want you to know that all came through in your book.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. It's hard to know when you're writing, late at night, all alone in an office, just trying to get these ideas across. And I'm so glad to hear that it came through.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, it did. So one of the things that I found really compelling about your book and some of the literature that came with it is just really, what brought you to trust or to study trust all these years. And one of the things you said briefly, and I'd love for you to expand on, is you say, regardless of their form, I have always been gripped by stories of guilt and redemption. That is quite a thing to be obsessed with, Peter.
Well, it's true. And I think one odd quirk in my background will help explain it. So I was raised in a devout Roman Catholic family. My father almost became a priest, actually, and decided against it. But despite that, that was a very strong influence in my younger days. And so, being exposed to the church, and I'm no longer practicing, but at the time it was very salient to me how much of Catholicism is about guilt and redemption, and probably most religions have a strong focus on those issues, and maybe it's because it is such a universal challenge for all of us.
And I love the stories that you also shared about, your parents working and sometimes not getting paid for the work that they did, and some of the impressions that left on you. It was just, as I said, you just really let us into your world in a way that I guess really, when I think about it, your book wouldn't be nearly as effective if you hadn't done that.
Well, thank you. I think one of the things that I decided to do when writing the book is, well, it occurred to me that one thing I needed to do at the start is to trust my audience, my reader, and to let them in. And it was important in the sense that it's very easy to focus on this phenomenon on a purely scientific level, to study this at arm's length, and you need to do that to maintain objectivity. But I wanted the reader to know at the beginning that despite my need to do that as a scientist, as a human being, this is far from arm's length. It is a very personal topic to me, as it is for so many people.
Mm-hmm. I think at this juncture, it makes a lot of sense for us to define what you actually mean by trust. And if you don't mind, what I'd like to do is read just a short passage of that and then have you comment on it. Because I think what I'm clear about too, Peter, is you have chosen every word with strong precision and conviction, and it's really beautiful. So you talk about how social scientists have defined trust as, quote, a psychological state comprising the intention to accept vulnerability based on positive expectations of the intentions or behavior of another. That's very powerful. Can you talk a little bit more about the definition and what's in there?
Absolutely. So it is a rather lengthy definition on one level, but it's lengthy for a reason. And it's because even though trust may seem like a simple idea, it can be easily confused with other ideas. And it's only by looking at these components and taking them seriously that we can really distinguish trust from other things. And so one, a psychological state. So this gets to the fact that many times we gauge trust simply through behavior. And so the traditional research on trust up to that point had primarily focused on whether or not you simply cooperate or not. And the problem with that approach to understanding trust is that there are many times when you act as if you trust, when you don't really trust at all. And so sometimes the situation will compel you to act as if you trust the other person, or the incentives are oriented in a certain way. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you think well enough about the other person to make yourself vulnerable. And so this vulnerability component is another essential element. And that gets to the fact that sometimes we might cooperate when there isn't any real downside. We need to believe that there's some risk involved in a situation in order for us to manifest this trust. And this gets to the fact that sometimes people try to enable cooperative behavior by mitigating risk as an alternative. And that can have its uses. It can be very important to do that in many cases. But if that's the approach, what you're doing is enabling cooperative behavior without the need to trust, by just making the vulnerability unnecessary because the risk has been removed. And so those elements are essential for distinguishing trust from things like cooperation or cooperative behavior more broadly, and situations where you enable that through this mitigation of risk, by just protecting yourself, or by just forcing others to behave in a certain way so that you can cooperate with them. Those are very different kinds of approaches to getting to an endpoint, but not approaches that are synonymous with trust.
Okay, so now, because we've been speaking a bit conceptually here, it occurs to me that I want to throw it to a phenomenon or experience that I had just today, and maybe you could speak to that and what you just were trying to separate in terms of those concepts. So what happened was, and I'm sure I wouldn't have even had this on my mind had I not read your book, but I drove to meet a client today for lunch, and as I was driving there along 635, mind you, traffic was moving fairly quickly, so that was the first impediment here. But I observed a man who was out, he was walking, or standing, I should say, and I thought, why is this man standing on the median, of this, 5-lane freeway? Maybe there's some mental issues here or something. Then I saw that he was sort of, waving this red gas can. And I thought, okay, so he's run out of gas. I understand that. However, I can't see a car. where's the car that goes with the can of gas? So on the basis of how fast traffic was moving, which I could have found a way to pull over even though, and that I couldn't see a car, which really made me question, is this man, and I'm a woman, going to stop and pick up a man? I didn't do it. So having said what you said before about those different concepts, maybe you could kind of help us understand what was happening there.
Wow, that's a very interesting scenario. Well, and I think one of the things it raises is this distinction between this behavior, how behavior can be affected by both trust and risk.
Mm-hmm.
So you may have stopped to help this person if the risk wasn't so high. For example, if there were many people on the side of the road, for example, who weren't in cars, but who could give you the sense that if something went awry, there would be people to stop that individual from attacking you or robbing you or so on. So whether you stopped can be determined by that assessment of risk, irrespective of how much trust you have in that person. So there's that individual involved there. And so that's one of the factors that can affect that behavior. And again, it's why we need to look at those positive expectations as a cognition that isn't necessarily something that or is something that we consider independently of these other influences, because lots of things can influence behavior. And so that kind of assessment is very important. And so, whether you stop to help that person may have also been influenced by a host of other considerations. For example, what did the person look like? Did the person seem disheveled, or did the person seem clean cut? Did you encounter a similar incident like this yourself, running out of gas? And did you have to walk a few miles in an attempt to find a gas station? And that might explain why this person didn't have a car nearby. There are a variety of things that we attend to when we make these decisions about whether to trust another. And we can't discount the fact that we are influenced by news reports. So the things that we might have encountered, maybe a story about someone, a Good Samaritan that was attacked by the person they were trying to help. Just one news story like that can be enough to affect our willingness to stop. So trust can be influenced by all these considerations, and it gets to how this initial trust in others, people we don't know, can be affected by societal considerations. What are the laws, rules, norms? It can be affected by your personal disposition. So someone in your exact same, in your car with you might have had a different inclination in that exact same situation based on their disposition. And then third, what are the cues that we are getting based on the situation? So all those combine to affect our willingness to take that risk.
Beautifully explicated, Dr. Kim. So listeners and viewers, those of you who have not yet read the book, as I have, his book is full, just beautifully full of all kinds of events that you're going to recognize, where he goes on to explain and help us understand why we trusted one person and didn't another. It's just really well done. So that was another great example of you doing it on the fly. You didn't get any notice that was coming your way. So thank you for that. Okay, so that makes me then have to ask you then, based on that was just my interaction, one little small thing today. Now I want, if you could, to talk about how understanding how trust works helps us as individuals first, and then society.
The main thing to consider when it comes to trust is that all social interactions, well, maybe not all, but the vast majority are mixed motive in nature. So we all benefit when we cooperate with one another, but we also have individual incentives to take advantage. And that accounts for how we engage with one another in work settings, in disputes, in negotiations, our views about taxation, and public goods and public bads, and so on. So what we know about trust is that given that fact of life, that these situations are mixed motive in nature, the evidence indicates that those who are more willing to trust, when there's higher trust, those kinds of interactions are more successful. We wind up better off when there's greater trust, not only individually, but also as a society. The more cooperation, trust enables cooperation, and the more cooperation, the better off we are. And our willingness to trust not only others, but also ourselves, it enables constructive action. So if we believe someone is worth that trust, we're more likely to invest in that relationship. And when we invest in that relationship, it turns out that rather than treat this as an opportunity for exploitation, most people, when they're trusted, they want to prove us right. So they reciprocate that behavior. So we can create a self-fulfilling prophecy in this respect. So when we trust others, they are inclined to treat that as a precious resource to maintain for the future, and they're more likely to trust us in turn. And again, that leads to better cooperation and more constructive behavior overall. And we can see this in society at the most macro level, where studies have looked at the relationship between societal level of trust and economic prosperity. And in fact, there is a strong direct correlation between the two.
That is incredibly powerful. So listeners and viewers, we're going to dig more into how he did his research and actually the determinants of trust after our first break. But let's grab that first. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. We're on the air with Dr. Peter Kim, who is a professor of management and organization at the Marshall School of Business at the University of Southern California. He's also the author of How Trust Works, the science of how relationships are built, broken, and repaired. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Dr. Alise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Alise to speak to your organization, please visit her at alisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Alise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Alise, send an email to Alise, A-L-I-S-E, at alisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. As I too am dedicated to my craft and I'm out to help create a world where people realize their potential at work and are led by inspirational leaders who help them find and contribute their greatness, and we do business that betters the world, I keep writing my own books. And so my latest, it came out in March of 2023. It's called The Great Revitalization, How Activating Meaning and Purpose Can Radically Enliven Your Business. And I wrote it to help readers understand what today's workforce wants, and then I offer 22 best practices to equip them to provide it to their leadership and their culture. You can learn about all of my books at alisecortez.com and find them on Amazon. If you are just joining us, my guest today is Dr. Peter Kim. He's the author of How Trust Works, the science of how relationships are built, broken, and repaired. So now at this juncture that we have, I think, very adequately whet the appetite of our listeners and viewers as just to what you've been doing and why it's important. Now I want to hear about the research. I too have done research, and it's no small, easy affair, and you've been doing it for decades. So can you say a little bit about how you've done your research?
Absolutely. So over the past 20 years or so, I think it's closer to 25 at this point, I've been exploring this question by studying thousands of people at this stage through surveys, adaptations of real life situations, and other types of experiments. Usually, what I've done with this work on trust in particular is to take inspiration from events that have occurred in real life, something that might be in the news, and use that as a basis for exploring questions that are not only of practical importance, but also of theoretical importance, questions that we don't really have much insight into. And so this might take, for example, the form of some incident that's occurred in the news, and then creating versions of that scenario where we might ask, well, what would have happened if this person said something else instead, or done something else instead? Well, I have the resources to create alternative versions of these scenarios. Sometimes this involves just pen and paper descriptions of what happened and what was said. Other times it involves using the actual video clips and combining them with photos or images. And there have been occasions where I've gone into TV studios to create news stories that report on the events in slightly different ways, so that I can, through a scientific, rigorous process, compare people's reactions depending on the different tweaks that I might have made to these situations.
Well, I love research, so I would love to be working with you on those things. That sounds incredibly fascinating. And having those kind of resources is really amazing. Okay, so next, if you talk in your book about really discovering two powerful determinants of trust. Can you let us in that secret?
Absolutely. So there are a variety of considerations that can affect our trust in others. And researchers have identified as many as 10 different characteristics. But what we find across different studies is that even though there's variation depending on variation in terms of what's important depending on the type of relationship, that two characteristics tend to be the most important across situations and across relationships. And those considerations are competence and integrity. So that affects our evaluations of leaders, subordinates, coworkers, and so on. And those considerations are especially important because it turns out there are odd elements of our mental basement that leads us to weigh information about competence and integrity quite differently. So it turns out that there's an asymmetry, there's a positive bias when it comes to matters of competence. We weigh positive information about competence much more heavily than negative information about competence. But for matters of integrity, that's reversed. We weigh negative information about integrity much more heavily than positive information about integrity. And these asymmetries are important because a lot of responses that are used after a trust violation tend to be double-edged in nature. Like an apology, that is beneficial in the sense that it conveys remorse, but it can also convey the fact that you are in fact guilty. So it has both negative information about guilt and positive information about the likelihood of redemption. And if we weigh those signals differently, depending on how the situation is viewed as a matter of competence or integrity, that means that the exact same response, like an apology, can be very beneficial in some situations, but really harmful in others.
I found that to be an incredibly, elucidating, alluring, how you explained that. It made so much sense to me, Dr. Kim. It was like, wow, that just really opened my understanding. And then further, if we can, I want to take this notion of, you said earlier, and I want to build on this, especially for inside organizations and how leaders consider this, is you said that for most of us, when someone trusts us, we want to prove them right. So likewise, you say, consider the seemingly questionable practice of gauging the trustworthiness of others based on their faces. evidence suggests that even this seemingly arbitrary reason to trust other people can sometimes have a predictive value. What I want to get to on this for the application of the world of work, one of the things that I have come to understand in my work as a management consultant is in this world where people are increasingly wanting to stay with the notion of some kind of virtual hybrid workplace scenario, what we see increasingly is many organizations pushing back on that. And when you really press them on why that's so, they will oftentimes reveal that they don't trust the workers to do actual work when they can't see them. And so I find this idea of, giving people trust because they want to make sure and treat it as a precious resource, as you said before, and keep it to be quite interesting. And it'd be interesting if you could say a bit about maybe how that might play out in today's workplace. I know that's a lot to take on, but just the notion of trust when it comes to not being able to see your workers and believe that they're actually working for you.
I think it's an interesting crossroads that we're facing nowadays, precisely because we've had to change our work habits so dramatically through COVID. And I think you're right that part of the reason why organizations are so eager to get workers back is that they don't necessarily trust them to be as productive, to be as conscientious at home than at work. And so they want to monitor them. And this gets to an orientation organizations have about trying to reduce risk through this monitoring system. So they want to encourage cooperative behavior by reducing risk, by having bosses watch these people and make sure they're doing all this work. HR practices are often designed around the mitigation of risk and what can they do to sort of keep people in line. And so that is one way of going about it. The issue there is that there's a clear downside, and that downside from the employee perspective certainly is that they can't work at home. But even from an organizational perspective, there are real downsides in the sense that to have this monitoring system, really keep track of all these employees and really watch them and keep them in line, you need an enormous bureaucracy. HR departments need all these rules and regulations about what people can or cannot do. And that may prevent some people who might abuse the situation from going ahead and doing that. But what you clearly give up is the resources that are devoted to that monitoring system, to maintaining this enormous bureaucracy that could have been devoted to other ends that might have been good for the organization. So one example that I teach in my MBA classrooms is the case of Netflix. And they talk about this problem, and they talk about how as small organizations grow, they just develop all this bureaucracy, these rules and regulations to keep control over what's going on. And that stifles innovation, that keeps people from doing things because they're not quite sure if this is allowed and so on. And there's a real downside to that. Netflix recognizes that. And what do they do instead? They just have one rule, and that is to work in Netflix's best interest. And that's it. They don't even have a vacation policy. So if you believe that you need a vacation and you're entitled to a vacation, you can take a vacation. And, there's certainly stories about Netflix that talk about the downsides of this. There's a lot of social pressure to not abuse these rules. But the main point of this is that you don't get off scot-free by just insisting on this monitoring approach. And in fact, I just read that Apple has an interesting policy for their higher performers. The higher you are as a performer, the better you do, the more freedom you have. and
Interesting.
it's an attempt to trust people that are worthy of that trust.
This is really, really incredibly useful, Dr. Kim. This is something that I really am passionate about, trying to help create these workplaces where people can thrive, and that's really a sticky point today. So thank you for really illuminating that. What I want to do next, this really is also quite interesting here, is you've got a section in your book where you talk about what we can do to make ourselves less vulnerable to those violators that might want to do something that would actually make us not want to trust them. You talk about how some people that actually are out to harm us are targeting certain people, and I think it's interesting. You've got a whole section that talks about that. So if you could just say a little bit about what can we do to make ourselves not targets of somebody who might want to violate our trust, or why we actually, or our risk goes with it.
Well, clearly every time we trust someone, we do make ourselves vulnerable, and there is a real risk that's undertaken in those situations, and so one of the things that people do, that we talked about a bit before, is this idea of protecting themselves, creating some sort of system that will prevent them from taking advantage. When you do that, it creates another problem that we didn't discuss before, and it's that this might lead them to behave in a trustworthy manner, but you will always have the question of, did they do that because of the monitoring system or because they're actually trustworthy? You don't know, because you've created this system to keep them from exploiting you. And that problem, that creates a problem in other situations, gray area situations, where that monitoring system isn't going to protect you as well. In fact, if we were to think about different cultures, Japan has a social system that's designed to keep people in line through social norms, and that keeps people behaving in a trustworthy way. The problem is that it also keeps people from moving in and out of networks, entering new partnerships with new companies that are outside their networks, and so on. And so there's been a real downside there when it comes to that focus. So for us, I think the lesson is that we do need to give people the benefit of the doubt. It doesn't necessarily mean that we make ourselves entirely vulnerable, but it can mean that we initiate little acts of trust and see what happens. And so I know George Bush is from Texas,
Yes.
and I recall a story about him that is germane, and it's how when he would meet someone, he would share a little secret with them. And so he would trust them with something that was not a national security risk, but he would share a little tidbit with them, and that was a way of exhibiting trust and allowing the other side to either nurture that trust, or if they weren't inclined to do that, well, he would find out without making himself entirely vulnerable. So those kinds of steps can help. You don't have to trust entirely right away, but to have a bias towards trust and give people the opportunity to live up to that expectation, I think is going to be a better road, because the evidence indicates that even people who have this irrational bias towards trust, they wind up better off, precisely for the reasons that we talked about. People want to fulfill that expectation, and even this trust based on arbitrary reasons, that how their faces look. It turns out the evidence indicates that people who are trusted for that reason wind up being more trustworthy, precisely for the reasons that we talked about.
I'm drinking all this in, Dr. Kim. It's wonderful. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. We're going to here with Dr. Peter Kim. He's a professor of management and organization at the Marshall School of Business at the University of Southern California and the author of How Trust Works, the science of how relationships are built, broken, and repaired. After the break, we're going to get into the key components of an effective apology and why sometimes an apology is a bad idea. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Dr. Alise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Alise to speak to your organization, please visit her at alisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Alise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Alise, send an email to Alise, A-L-I-S-E, at alisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thank you for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. I mentioned in the last break that my latest book came out in March. It's called The Great Revitalization. I also created an assessment for you on my website. You can go to alisecortez.com and find this assessment. You'll be able to download it. It's a 3-page thing. And you'll be able to ascertain the extent to which your company actually is meeting the needs of today's workforce through that assessment. If you are just joining us, my guest is Dr. Peter Kim. He's the author of How Trust Works, the science of how relationships are built, broken, and repaired. Before we get into the components of an effective apology, I would love it if you could say a little bit. You talked early in the book about homeboy industries and how it can serve to restore trust on a societal level. That seems appropriate to talk about at some point in this conversation. So could you now?
So Homeboy Industries is located in Los Angeles, and they are an organization devoted to reintegrating former offenders, people with criminal backgrounds, back into society. And so they have these programs for these individuals that would allow them to work in various kinds of businesses. The bakeries, for example, it's one of the classic businesses that they operate to give people the opportunity to gain employment. And that's one of the major hurdles for those who are released from prison. A lot of repeat offenses are the result of people being released and having no employment prospects, and right. and being in a situation where they just see future crimes as the only option for them. And it really speaks to the challenges we face in society, because regardless of where you stand on the political spectrum, I tend to be independent, maybe centrist independent, but regardless of where you stand, people agree that we need to fix the system, and surveys have looked at this issue, and there is consensus on the need to find better solutions, and yet we still face this problem after decades, and the U.S. is in a really bad spot relative to most of the rest of the world in terms of incarceration. And why is this? It gets to the fact that we are so conflicted about how to manage this process. On the one hand, we believe that there's a sense of justice being about, paying a certain price for your crimes. But on the other hand, there's another side of us that gets to these gut reactions we have to people who have that kind of background. And it gets to, in part, one of the things that gets to is how we weigh matters of integrity. If we believe someone has committed an offense intentionally, there's a serious uphill battle that we create that makes it very, very difficult for anyone to overcome. And so that's the challenge for us. I don't have a quick remedy. I mean, there are people who study that area in particular, but that chapter in the book was really designed to explore, well, what are the things in our mental basement that's affecting this process? And it turns out that one of the problems is that we shift back and forth between these views. On the one hand, we believe that we need to allow for redemption. On the other hand, when something bad happens, we are quite intolerant of those who might advocate for redemption. And the question is, well, if that's the case, how do we rectify this problem? And then the other element of it is that how we weigh matters of guilt and redemption, like the calculus, what does it take to come back from something that's terrible? Well, that's affected by other things in our subconscious that leads us to do that calculus in ways that we don't even realize. And so many times when we perceive one another, we can get to a situation where we might feel like we have paid the price and we should be reintegrated into society, and others have a very different view. And so that was an attempt to explore some of those challenges as an attempt to at least help us better understand what we need to resolve.
I wanted you to speak about that, Peter, because part of what I'm out to do is I speak to audiences about really elevating business, from the stakeholder capitalism lens, from a conscious capitalism lens, the evolved lens, etc. My last book talks about this. Is encouraging employers to look at employing those who had been previously incarcerated, because it helps strengthen communities. It makes the world a better place. If all we're doing is giving these people just a row back to where they came, I don't see how that helps society. So I've been advocating for this as well. So that's part of the reason I really wanted you to speak about that, because I believe very strongly in this. So thank you for that. Okay, did you want to say something else?
Well, I was just going to add, that is we talked about the virtuous cycle of trusting others.
Yeah.
There's a vicious cycle when we don't trust others, and
right.
And it is easy for people to fulfill that expectation, and it doesn't mean that we just make ourselves vulnerable to everyone that's released. Of course, there's a danger there, but we do need to work towards systems that can better manage that balance, and so I'm so glad to hear that you are working towards the same purpose.
Mm-hmm. I think we're a good pair. Okay, so I have also seen this research before on what makes for an effective apology, and you've got, I think it's 6 components here, and I've seen them before. I think it bears us talking about them just briefly, and then I want to also really talk about the other side of sometimes why that could be a bad idea, which you talk about beautifully in your book. So I know you were citing the research of Roy Lewicki, Beth Pullen, and Robert Lount Jr. So I know that you're very, very methodical about your research. I do want to put it off that this is your saying this is from their vantage point, but could you talk about those 6 components of an apology?
So they have identified these 6 components from previous studies, and they wanted to explore, well, okay, how important are these components? And so they had these studies that they developed using variations of these responses that would offer just one or multiple components. And they find that, so these 6 components are an expression of regret. That's number 1. 2, an explanation that conveys the reasons why the offense occurred. Number 3, an acknowledgement of responsibility. Number 4, a declaration of repentance. Number 5, an offer of repair. And number 6, a request for forgiveness. And what the bottom line of the research is that they find that the more components are included, the more effective the apology is. And if you were to think about the specific components, the acknowledgement of responsibility and the offer of repair were the most important in their studies. So that is an indication that the type of apology can matter. And I do know of various efforts to help people apologize more effectively. I think in hospitals with doctors, there is a recognition that, after medical errors, getting a doctor to apologize can, in some instances, be very helpful in terms of reducing the likelihood of litigation and so on. But the apology needs to be conveyed effectively. And so there's some attempt to do that. But the other side of the coin that my research raises is that if you just focus on the apology, then you are missing a big part of the equation. It's like going back to your driving illustration at the beginning. If you were to drive on a road trying to avoid traffic accidents by only looking straight ahead and ignoring the cross traffic, that would be a really bad idea. Right. You'd risk being involved in a side collision. And it's the same thing for attempts to repair trust. If you just focus on how thorough the apology is, you may wind up quite surprised to witness that it actually made things worse. And there are plenty of incidents that the book points to that illustrates this point. The reason why we focus on apologies as sort of the main remedy is the result of the Tylenol pill tampering case that occurred in Chicago decades ago.
You talk about it in your book, yeah.
Yeah, and it can help in many instances, but what a lot of the attempts to apply that lesson overlook is that there was a specific type of violation involved here, and it was a competence-based violation. For matters of competence, an apology is effective because we don't weigh the negative information about guilt as heavily as the positive information about redemption. And so by Johnson & Johnson taking full ownership over what happened, we believe that they're going to fix the problem. But for matters of integrity, that relationship's reversed. So we focus on the negative confirmation of guilt and we discount positive signals of redemption. And that's why you need to have a better sense of how the situation is viewed, how the violation is viewed, before you think about what kind of response may be appropriate.
And there, Dr. Kim, is why I believe your work is revolutionary. You really can radically change and improve the world if people will embrace what you have taught us. I really believe that. So I want to say thank you for coming on Working in Purpose, for writing this beautiful book. I think your work is profoundly important, and I'm very happy to share it with my listeners and viewers across the world on Working in Purpose.
Thank you, Dr. Cortez. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Listeners and viewers, if you want to learn more about this magnificent man, Dr. Peter Kim, his research in trust, or his book, How Trust Works, The Science of How Relationships Are Built, Broken, and Repaired, start by visiting his site, which is peterhkim.com. Again, Peter, the initial H, Kim.com. Last week, if you missed the live show, you can always catch a recorded podcast. We're on the air with Steve Farrell talking about his book, A New Universal Dream, and the nonprofit that he started called Humanities Team. We learned about the work he and the Humanities Team are doing in transformational education to elevate people toward a sacred understanding of the oneness and beautiful interdependence of all life forms. Why is that important? Because when we can actually focus on serving others beyond ourselves in self-transcendence, everybody wins. Next week, we'll be on the air with Dr. Matt Popsell talking about his new book, Expand the Circle, Enlighten Leadership for Our Own World of Work. See you there. And remember, work is an essential part of our lives, ultimately the way we spend our lives, and can be one of the best adventures and means of realizing our potential and making the impact we crave. So let's work on purpose.
We hope you've enjoyed this week's program. Be sure to tune in to Working on Purpose, featuring your host, Dr. Alise Cortez, each week on W4CY. Together, we'll create a world where business operates conscientiously, leadership inspires impassioned performance, and employees are fulfilled in work that provides the meaning and purpose they crave. See you there. Let's work on purpose.